My name is Olivia Hartwell. I'm 34 years old, and for the past 3 years, I worked as a senior systems administrator at a logistics technology company in Seattle. If you had met me at the office, you probably wouldn't have remembered much about me. I wasn't the loud one in meetings. I wasn't the one who stayed late talking politics in the break room. And I definitely wasn't the person who argued when someone interrupted me mid-sentence. Most people simply knew me as the quiet IT woman. The one who fixed things, the one who answered emails quickly, the one who showed up, solved problems, and then disappeared back into the background of blinking servers and cooling fans. And in most offices, that kind of quiet reliability becomes invisible. Not because people are cruel, but because when something always works, people stop asking why it works. For 3 years, that was my place in the company. Reliable, useful, invisible. Then one morning, during a routine meeting that should have lasted 10 minutes, my boss fired me. The reason? I arrived 7 minutes late. 7 minutes! No warning. No conversation afterward. Just a quick decision made in front of the team. The kind of decision managers make when they believe they're sending a message about discipline. And to be fair, maybe he thought he was. But there was one small detail no one in that room had considered. Later that afternoon, the company had scheduled a critical system maintenance operation, the kind that temporarily shuts down internal services, the kind that requires access to the legacy authentication server. And that server required a master password, a password that only one person had. Me. This story isn't about revenge. There was no yelling, no dramatic confrontation, no clever speech that changed everyone's mind. What happened instead was quieter than that, and in some ways, much more revealing. Because sometimes the most powerful moments in life don't come from fighting back. They come from simply stepping aside and letting people discover what they overlooked. So today, I'm going to tell you exactly what happened, how a normal workday turned into the moment my entire career changed, and how something as small as 7 minutes revealed the difference between being visible and being valued. But before we get to the meeting where everything happened, I want to start a little earlier. Back when I was still just the quiet person in the server room, the person everyone trusted to keep things running, but rarely thought about at all. And I'm curious about something before we begin. Have you ever been in a situation where people relied on your work every day, without really seeing you? For most of the 3 years I worked at the company, I existed in a very specific category of employee, the kind people trust, but rarely notice. My name is Olivia Hartwell, and in the office directory, my title was Senior Systems Administrator. If you asked anyone in the building what that meant, they would probably say something simple like, she handles the servers, which was technically true, but like many technical roles, the most important parts of the job were the ones no one ever saw. Most mornings I arrived before 8. The office lights were still dim in the hallways, and the only sounds came from the cleaning staff finishing their rounds and the quiet hum of the server room behind the glass wall near the back corridor. That room was where I spent the first part of almost every day, checking logs, reviewing overnight alerts, making sure backups are completed successfully. It was routine work, but routine is exactly what keeps systems stable. When things run smoothly, it usually means someone is paying attention before problems become visible. That someone was usually me. In the rest of the office, people were beginning their mornings in louder ways. Coffee machines, casual conversations, sales calls starting early. I preferred the quieter start. Servers are predictable. People are not. By 9 o'clock, the building was fully awake, and that was when my other role began. The one that existed mostly through small requests scattered across the day. Olivia, could you reset my login? Olivia, the internal dashboard is loading slowly. Olivia, do you know why the shared drive disappeared for a minute? Most of the time, these were small issues, solved quickly, but every now and then, there were more complicated ones. Authentication errors, permission conflicts, scripts that failed quietly overnight. The company relied on a network of systems that had been built over many years, some modern, some older. Maintaining them required patience and attention to details that most people never notice. And slowly, over time, those details began to live mostly in my head. Not because I wanted them there, but because I was the one who kept documenting, adjusting, and maintaining the systems that connected everything together. In meetings, I usually sat near the end of the conference table with my laptop open and a small black leather notebook beside it. The notebook was something of a personal habit. Inside it were diagrams of server architecture, maintenance schedules, and fragments of conversations about upcoming system changes, things that didn't always make it into official documentation. At first, people had asked about it. "Still using paper notes?" someone once joked. I smiled. Paper doesn't crash. Eventually, no one commented on it anymore. It simply became part of the quiet background of meetings. Just like me. Our department manager, Daniel Foster, handled most of the speaking for the IT team. Daniel was sharp, efficient, and extremely focused on time. He believed meetings should move quickly, decisions should happen immediately, and explanations should be brief. That style worked well for him. It also meant that when technical details became complicated, Daniel often summarized them before the explanation was finished. Sometimes those explanations were mine. He wasn't rude about it, just fast. And since I wasn't someone who liked interrupting people to reclaim the floor, I usually let it go. The important part, in my mind, was that the systems still functioned. And they did. For 3 years, the company's internal infrastructure ran quietly and reliably. New employees joined, new tools were introduced, and the network slowly expanded to support the growing team. At the center of it all was a legacy authentication server that had been installed years before I joined the company. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Because the system was old, maintenance required careful handling. Scripts had been modified over time, access rules adjusted, and emergency recovery procedures added piece by piece. Gradually, without any official announcement, I became the person responsible for understanding how all of it fit together. Whenever something related to that server came up, people said the same thing. "Olivia will know." It sounded like confidence, and in many ways it was. But there is a subtle difference between being trusted and being seen. Trust means people rely on your work. Being seen means they understand what that work actually is. In our office, most people rely on the systems every day. Very few thought about the person maintaining them, including my manager. And for a long time, I assumed that was perfectly normal. The first moment that stayed with me didn't seem important at the time. In fact, if you had asked anyone else in the room that day, they probably wouldn't remember it at all. But small moments have a strange way of revealing patterns. It happened during a Monday morning operations meeting, about 8 months before everything fell apart. These meetings were meant to be short. 15 minutes, maybe 20, if something complicated came up. Representatives from product, sales, support, and IT would quickly update each other about anything that might affect the week ahead. Most people treated it like a routine formality. I treated it like a systems check. That morning, I had noticed something unusual while reviewing the overnight server logs. The legacy authentication server, the one supporting several internal tools, had triggered a sequence of minor warnings. Nothing dangerous yet, but the pattern suggested something could become unstable if maintenance wasn't scheduled soon. So when it was my turn to speak, I explained it calmly. "The authentication server has been generating repeated permission conflict warnings," I said, glancing briefly at my notes. "It's not affecting users yet, but we should probably schedule a maintenance window this week to reset the permission tree and rotate the root authentication keys." The room was quiet for a second, not confused, just waiting. Daniel leaned forward slightly in his chair. "How long would that take?" he asked. "About 2 hours," I replied. "Most of it would be preparation. Actual downtime should be less than 15 minutes. Yee. He nodded once, thinking. Then he spoke again. "Okay, so basically the server is fine for now." It wasn't a question, more like a conclusion. I hesitated for a moment. Technically, the server was fine. Today. But that wasn't really the point. "It's stable right now," I said carefully. "But the warning pattern usually means the authentication hierarchy is starting to fragment. If we wait too long, fixing it becomes more complicated." Daniel gave a quick half smile. "Let's not create work that isn't urgent." A few people around the table nodded slightly. Meetings like that reward confidence and speed. Daniel had both. I closed my notebook. "Okay," I said. And that was the end of the conversation. The meeting moved on to marketing updates, sales projections, and a discussion about an upcoming product release. No one thought about the server again, except me. After the meeting, I returned to the server room and ran another diagnostic check. The system was still functioning normally, but the warning flags were still there. Little yellow indicators inside the log reports, not failures, just signals that something inside the authentication structure was beginning to misalign. In technical systems, ignoring warnings rarely causes immediate damage. What it does instead is create complexity later. I wrote a note in my black leather notebook. Auth server, permission tree fragmentation starting, maintenance recommended. Then I underlined the date, not because I expected something dramatic to happen, just because I had learned something over the years. When small technical problems are postponed, they tend to return at inconvenient times. Still, Daniel wasn't entirely wrong. The system wasn't broken yet. And in most companies, urgency is defined by visible problems, not quiet warnings inside server logs. So I let the issue sit. Days passed, then weeks. The warnings appeared occasionally but didn't escalate. From the outside, everything continued working perfectly, which meant, in the eyes of the company, there was nothing to fix. Looking back now, that meeting wasn't really about the server at all. It was the first time I noticed something else, a small shift in how my role was understood. When I explained something technical, it wasn't always heard as information. Sometimes it was treated as a suggestion to be simplified. And simplification, in business environments, often means postponement. At the time, I didn't challenge it, because it seemed like such a small thing, just a brief moment in a routine meeting. But small moments are often where patterns begin, and once patterns begin, they tend to repeat. After that meeting, nothing dramatic changed, which in many workplaces is exactly how patterns begin. They don't arrive loudly, they settle in slowly, disguised as efficiency. Over the next few months, the same kind of moment happened again. Not identical, but similar enough that I began to recognize it. Another operations meeting, another technical detail, another quick summary from Daniel before the explanation finished. At first, I told myself it was just his communication style. Daniel moved fast. Everyone knew that. He believed meetings should be decisive, not analytical. When information became complicated, he simplified it for the room. That approach works well in many situations, but technical systems rarely reward simplification. One afternoon, I was explaining a scheduled update for the internal permission structure. Something small but necessary. The update would prevent conflicts between two departments that had recently gained access to overlapping project folders. It's mostly preventative, I said. If the current permissions remain unchanged, we'll probably see access conflicts once the new product team joins next quarter. Daniel nodded while glancing at his watch. So it's not an issue yet. Again, not a question. Not yet, I said. Then let's wait until it actually becomes one. A few people chuckled softly. Not at me, just at the casual certainty of the decision. The conversation moved on. No one thought twice about it, except me. Because technical maintenance is rarely about fixing what is broken. It's about preventing what will break. Still, I didn't push back. Part of it was personality. I've never been someone who enjoys turning a meeting into a debate, but part of it was something else, something quieter. Over time, you begin to notice the roles people unconsciously assign to one another inside organizations. Salespeople are expected to be confident. Managers are expected to be decisive. Engineers are expected to solve problems. And people like me, the quiet infrastructure types, are expected to quietly maintain whatever decisions everyone else makes. Do not challenge them. Just support them. I didn't resent that role. In fact, for a long time, it suited me perfectly. There is a certain freedom in being underestimated. When people assume you're simply maintaining things, they rarely interfere with how you actually do your work. And that meant I had space to build systems carefully, to document processes, to understand the details that others didn't track. So I adapted. Instead of trying to extend conversations in meetings, I simply made sure the systems could tolerate delays in maintenance. Backup scripts were improved, authentication recovery procedures were refined, permissions were logged more carefully. If the company preferred to postpone preventative work, my job quietly became ensuring that postponement wouldn't cause immediate damage. It was a practical solution, But it also meant something subtle was happening. Every time a technical concern was shortened, summarized, or postponed, the same quiet message repeated itself. Speed mattered more than depth. Certainty mattered more than caution. And the person explaining the risk didn't need to finish the explanation. Again, no one was intentionally disrespectful. No one rolled their eyes when I spoke. No one dismissed me openly. The meetings remained polite, professional, efficient. But over time, something small began to normalize. My role wasn't to explain. My role was to maintain, to adjust quietly behind the scenes, so that decisions made quickly in conference rooms would still function in the real world afterward. For a long time, that arrangement worked. The system stayed stable, the company continued growing, and from the outside, everything appeared perfectly smooth. But the longer that pattern continued, the clearer something became. When people stop listening to explanations, they also stop understanding what those explanations protect them from. And eventually, that misunderstanding grows large enough that it reveals itself. Not immediately, not loudly, just slowly enough that no one notices the moment when prevention quietly becomes dependence. At some point during my second year at the company, something subtle became clear to me. Not through a single conversation, not through a dramatic moment, but through repetition. Organizations, like systems, tend to assign roles whether anyone announces them or not. The longer people work together, the more predictable those roles become. Daniel was the decision maker. Sales drove urgency. Product pushed for new features. Support raised problems when customers noticed them. And me? I was the person who made sure none of those moving parts collided. Quietly, reliably, without requiring attention. The role wasn't written anywhere, but it appeared in small, everyday ways. If a meeting ran long and people started packing up laptops, someone would say, "Olivia will handle the technical part." If a new internal tool was approved, the assumption was that I would set up whatever was needed. If two departments accidentally gained overlapping access to something sensitive, someone would message me privately, rather than bring it up in the next meeting. I became a kind of invisible balancing mechanism inside the company's infrastructure, and I understood why. Most organizations prefer systems that appear effortless. The fewer people who have to think about how something works, the more they assume it will simply continue working. From their perspective, that meant everything was functioning perfectly. From mine, it meant I had quietly become the person holding several complicated pieces together. One afternoon, that realization arrived in a strangely ordinary way. The finance team had recently adopted a new internal reporting tool that connected to our authentication server. The rollout had happened quickly, and within a week, several employees reported intermittent login failures. Nothing catastrophic, just inconsistent. Daniel called a quick hallway conversation with two department leads. I was standing there as well, laptop under my arm. "Why are people getting locked out of the reporting dashboard?" someone asked. Daniel looked at me. "Olivia," I explained calmly, "the reporting tool is querying the legacy authentication server using an outdated permission mapping. It's creating duplicate identity tokens, which sometimes conflict with the existing session structure." The two department leads blinked slightly. Daniel nodded. "So basically the system just needs to be cleaned up." The explanation had taken 20 seconds. The summary took 3. And once again, the room seemed satisfied with the simplified version. I didn't correct it, because technically, yes, the system needed to be cleaned up. But what that meant in practice was 2 hours of carefully adjusting permission hierarchies, validating user roles, and updating scripts that had been layered on top of the authentication server over several years. Invisible work. Work that only became visible if something failed. Later that afternoon, I sat alone in the server room, watching the authentication logs scroll across my screen. Every company has 1 or 2 systems like this. Old enough to be complicated. Critical enough that replacing them is risky. Quiet enough that leadership rarely thinks about them. And because I had been the one maintaining it for years, I understood its structure more deeply than anyone else in the building. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel responsible. Systems like that require careful maintenance, patience, and long-term thinking. Things that don't always fit neatly into fast-moving business conversations, but the company trusted the results. They just didn't think much about the process, which meant something interesting had happened over time. I wasn't seen as someone who understood the system. I was seen as someone who kept it running, reliable, quiet, replaceable, at least in theory. And when a role becomes defined that way, people begin to treat it accordingly. Not with hostility, not even with disrespect, just with a kind of comfortable assumption. The assumption that the person in that role will always be there, always solving problems, always adjusting things quietly behind the scenes, so the rest of the organization never has to slow down. For a long time, I accepted that role without thinking much about it, because most days, it worked. The system stayed stable, the company grew, and the quiet infrastructure beneath everything continued functioning exactly as it should. But roles assigned quietly can change quietly too. Sometimes the person inside the role begins to see it differently, not suddenly, just slowly enough that no one else notices. The moment things began to change didn't happen in a meeting. There was no argument, no raised voices, no dramatic realization. It happened on a quiet Wednesday afternoon inside the server room. Most of the office had already shifted into its late-day rhythm. Keyboards tapping, quiet conversations near the coffee machine, someone laughing down the hallway. From inside the server room, those sounds were muted by the glass walls and the steady hum of the machines. I was reviewing authentication logs again. The same legacy server that had appeared in a few earlier meetings was still running smoothly on the surface. Users logged in without problems, internal tools synchronized normally. From the outside, nothing seemed unusual, but the warning flags I had noticed months earlier were still appearing, not frequently, just enough to remind me that the underlying structure was slowly becoming more fragile. Maintenance would fix it. It always did. The only problem was that maintenance had been postponed several times now. Not intentionally, just gradually pushed aside by more visible priorities. Product launches, new hiring waves, department reorganizations, the usual things that fill company calendars. I leaned back slightly in my chair and watched another line scroll across the log window. A small authentication conflict, automatically resolved, still harmless, but it reminded me of something technical teams learn early in their careers. Most system failures don't begin with one large problem. They begin with many small warnings that are easy to ignore. For the first time in a while, I opened the documentation folder for that server, the one I had been quietly maintaining since my first year at the company. Inside were configuration maps, recovery procedures, and maintenance scripts that had grown more detailed over time. Most of those documents existed because I had written them. At the very bottom of the folder was something most people never noticed: the root authentication recovery protocol. It was rarely used. Only during deep maintenance operations is the permission hierarchy needed to be reset entirely. Accessing that protocol required a master credential, a password created years earlier when the system had first been installed. I opened the file and checked the notes I had written beside it. Verified, stored offline, restricted access. It was standard practice in older systems to keep credentials like that under tight control to prevent accidental misuse. Over the years, the responsibility for maintaining that credential had simply remained with whoever managed the server most closely, which had become me. I closed the file again and sat quietly for a moment. The room hummed steadily around me. For the first time, I noticed something that hadn't really occurred to me before. Not in a dramatic way, just as a quiet observation. In the entire company, across every department and every meeting room, there was exactly one person who understood the full structure of that authentication system. One person maintained the documentation. One person who knew how to safely reset it if something went wrong. And that person sat alone in the server room on a Wednesday afternoon. The thought didn't make me feel proud. If anything, it made me pause. Because systems should never depend on a single individual. Good infrastructure is designed to survive absence. I had always assumed that eventually someone else would be brought into the process. Another systems administrator, maybe a consultant, someone who would learn the architecture and share the responsibility. But in 3 years, that hadn't happened. Not because anyone objected, simply because no one had asked. From the company's perspective, the system worked. And when something works quietly, it rarely attracts attention. I closed the server logs and wrote a short note in my leather notebook. Auth server maintenance is overdue. Knowledge centralized. Then I underlined the second sentence. It wasn't a complaint, just an observation. For the first time since joining the company, I realized something subtle but important. The quiet role I had accepted for years, the invisible maintainer behind the scenes, had slowly given me something else. Clarity. Not power, just clarity about how much of the system depended on things no one else had thought to understand. And once you see something like that clearly, it becomes difficult to unsee. That afternoon, nothing changed on the surface. The servers kept running, employees kept working, the company continued moving forward exactly as it always had. But internally, something small had shifted. Not in the system, in me. After that afternoon in the server room, nothing about my behavior changed in any visible way. I still arrived early. I still reviewed the logs every morning. I still attended the operations meetings with my laptop open and my leather notebook beside it. From the outside, I was the same quiet systems administrator everyone had always known. But internally, something had shifted. Not dramatically, just enough to make me start paying closer attention. When you maintain technical systems for long enough, you learn an important principle. Awareness changes how you observe patterns. Once you understand where the pressure points are, you begin to see how decisions ripple through a structure. That's what started happening in meetings. Before, when Daniel summarized a technical explanation quickly, I would sometimes try to clarify afterward. Now, I simply listened. When someone proposed a new tool that connected to our authentication system without discussing the architecture, I made a note. When maintenance windows were postponed again because something more urgent appeared, I recorded the date. None of this was dramatic. No one noticed. Silence is easy to misinterpret in workplaces. People often assume silence means agreement, or uncertainty, or lack of confidence. In reality, silence can simply mean someone is observing. And observation, over time, produces understanding. One Monday morning meeting illustrated this perfectly. The product team had just finalized the timeline for a new internal analytics dashboard. The tool would pull user metrics from several internal services, including the authentication server. As the discussion unfolded, someone asked the usual question. IT can connect it to the login system, right? Daniel looked toward me. Olivia, that shouldn't be complicated. Again, it wasn't phrased as a question, more like an assumption. I thought briefly about explaining the architecture, how the analytics system would interact with permission tokens, how older authentication layers might need adjustments to avoid conflicts. But I had already explained similar things before. Instead, I nodded. Yes, I said calmly. It can be connected. Daniel smiled slightly. Perfect. The meeting moved on. Later that afternoon, I implemented the integration. It worked, just as expected. But I also noticed something else while reviewing the server logs afterward. The authentication system had gradually become the central dependency for far more internal tools than when I first joined the company. The reporting dashboard, the analytics platform, the customer support portal, several internal developer environments. Over time, as new systems were added quickly, they all leaned on the same underlying authentication structure. It made sense. Centralized identity management simplifies user access, but it also creates something engineers recognize immediately: a single point of operational dependency. Again, that wasn't unusual. Many companies operate that way. What was unusual was how little awareness existed around it. Most departments saw the login system as something simple, the thing that allowed employees to sign in every morning. Very few understood the deeper layers behind it: the scripts, the permission trees, the emergency recovery protocols, and the root credentials required to maintain them. In meetings, when people discussed those systems, the conversations stayed comfortably abstract. IT will handle it. Olivia will set it up. Should be fine. And because the systems kept working, no one questioned those assumptions. I continued doing my job exactly as before, fixing small issues, monitoring system health, documenting changes. But now, every time a new tool connected to the authentication structure, I added a small note to my notebook. Not out of concern, just awareness. Because the more connections a system has, the more important its stability becomes, and the more people depend on something, It can be more surprising when they realize how that dependency actually works. Still, I didn't interrupt anyone. I didn't challenge decisions. From the outside, my silence probably looked like the same quiet compliance people had always expected. But silence can mean many things. Sometimes it means someone doesn't have anything to say. And sometimes it means they're waiting. Not for a mistake, just for the moment when understanding arrives on its own. If you walked through our office during those months, nothing would have looked unusual. The company was growing. New employees arrived almost every week, laptops still in their packaging boxes, onboarding sessions filling the smaller conference rooms. The product team celebrated milestones. Sales numbers climbed steadily. Leadership talked about expansion. From the outside, it was a healthy company. And technically speaking, the systems supporting it were healthy too. But behind that stability, something subtle was happening. Something no one else seemed to notice. Preparation. Not for a crisis, just for clarity. In technical infrastructure, one of the most important habits you can develop is documentation. Systems change constantly, and if knowledge exists only in someone's memory, eventually it disappears. So over time, I had built a habit. Every change was recorded. Every maintenance procedure is written out step by step. Every dependency is mapped carefully in diagrams. That work had started during my first year simply because the legacy authentication server was complicated enough that I didn't want to rely on memory alone. Now those documents had grown into something larger, a quiet blueprint of how much of the company depended on that system. One evening, after most people had left the office, I opened the architecture map I had been maintaining. The authentication server sat at the center. From it, several connections branched outward. Employee logins, internal analytics, finance reporting, customer support tools, development environments. Each connection looked simple individually, but together they formed a web. And that web had expanded significantly during my 3 years there. None of that was anyone's fault. Companies grow quickly, and when something works reliably, new systems naturally connect to it. That's how infrastructure evolves. But infrastructure also carries responsibility. If something sits at the center of many processes, the people managing it need to understand exactly how fragile or stable it really is. So I began doing something I had never formally scheduled before. I started running full dependency audits. Not because anyone asked, just because it seemed responsible. The audits were quiet work, reviewing authentication calls from different services, tracing permission hierarchies, ensuring backup credentials and recovery procedures were correctly documented. And slowly, piece by piece, the picture became clearer. The legacy authentication server wasn't just an old piece of infrastructure anymore. It had quietly become the gatekeeper for nearly every internal system employees used during the day. Most people saw the login screen in the morning and assumed it was a simple gateway. But behind that gateway was a chain of scripts, permissions, tokens, and validation layers that kept the entire structure synchronized. Maintaining it required a careful balance. And one detail remained exactly the same as it had been for years: the root authentication credential. The master access key is used only during deep system maintenance. It wasn't something that appeared in daily operations, but when maintenance became necessary, the kind that reset permission structures or repaired deeper authentication conflicts, that credential was essential. Without it, the process stopped. Over the years, I had checked that credential periodically as part of standard protocol, verified, stored offline, documented in the recovery procedure. The responsibility for maintaining it had never been reassigned, not officially, simply because the system had continued working, which meant something quietly unusual had developed. In a company of more than 100 employees, across product teams, engineering teams, leadership teams, exactly one person regularly interacted with the deepest layer of that authentication system: me. Again, that realization didn't feel dramatic. It felt structural. Like noticing a support beam in a building most people walk past without thinking. The building still stands, but someone needs to understand how that beam works. So I continued doing what I had always done: documenting, maintaining, checking dependencies. No one in the office noticed those audits happening. And honestly, they didn't need to. Infrastructure work is meant to be quiet. If people are thinking about it constantly, something is probably already broken. From their perspective, everything was still smooth. Employees log in every morning, tools loaded normally, meetings focused on growth and strategy. The systems beneath those conversations continued functioning exactly as expected. But inside my notebook, the documentation had become something more than technical notes. It had become a complete map of responsibility. Not assigned responsibility, just the kind that accumulates slowly when someone keeps maintaining the same system year after year. And maps like that reveal something interesting. They show you not just how things work, but how many people would struggle to rebuild them if the map suddenly disappeared. The moment of realization didn't feel like a discovery. It felt more like confirming something I had quietly suspected for a while. It happened late one evening, long after most of the office had emptied. The lights in the main workspace had dimmed automatically, leaving only the soft glow of desk lamps and the steady blue indicators inside the server room. I had stayed behind to prepare documentation for an upcoming maintenance window. Not an urgent one, just routine work that had finally been approved after several postponed discussions. Inside the maintenance folder, I opened the Authentication recovery protocol again. It was a document I had written gradually over the years, expanding it each time the system required deeper adjustments. Step-by-step instructions, safety checks, rollback procedures. Everything needed to safely reset the permission hierarchy without interrupting more services than necessary. At the center of that procedure sat a single line: root authentication credential required. It was the final step before the system allowed big structural changes. Without it, maintenance could begin, but it couldn't finish. I scrolled through the document slowly, reviewing each section the way engineers often do, not just reading instructions, but mentally rehearsing the process. Stop services, validate dependencies, reset permission branches, rebuild authentication tokens, verify recovery scripts, then the final step, root access. The password itself wasn't stored inside the document. That would have been irresponsible. Instead, the note simply described the storage method: an encrypted offline credential, verified periodically and maintained by the systems administrator responsible for the authentication server, which, for the last 3 years, had been me. I leaned back slightly in my chair and looked at the quiet rows of servers behind the glass. There was nothing unusual about a system having restricted credentials. In fact, that was the whole point of security. Access is limited, so mistakes don't happen accidentally, but security structures also assume something else. They assume knowledge is shared across responsible people, usually more than one, usually documented clearly, usually discussed during handovers when teams grow or responsibilities shift. I tried to remember if that conversation had ever happened, if anyone had asked about the deeper maintenance procedures, if Daniel had ever requested a full architecture briefing, if leadership had ever scheduled a transition plan for the legacy authentication server. Nothing came to mind. Again, not because anyone objected, simply because the system had never failed. And when something never fails, it rarely triggers curiosity. I opened the credential verification record, another document I maintained quietly as part of the maintenance process. Each entry showed the date when the root authentication credential had been checked and confirmed. 3 months ago. 6 months before that. Another entry the year before. Each one was signed by the same person, Olivia Hartwell. I closed the document and sat quietly for a moment, not surprised, just aware. Because when you look at a system long enough, patterns become obvious. The authentication server had become central to the company's internal infrastructure. Dozens of services depended on it. Hundreds of daily logins passed through it. Maintenance requires careful control to avoid disrupting the entire organization. And the deepest level of that maintenance, the step that allowed the system to rebuild its internal structure safely, required a credential maintained by one person. Not by policy, just by habit. The realization didn't make me feel powerful. If anything, it made me slightly uncomfortable. Good systems distribute knowledge, healthy teams avoid single points of failure, but over time, the combination of quiet infrastructure work and fast-moving company growth had created exactly that situation. A system everyone depended on, maintained quietly by someone most people barely noticed. I reached for my notebook and wrote a short sentence beneath the maintenance notes. Auth root credential. Single point of operational knowledge. Then I closed the notebook. Nothing about that sentence was dramatic. It didn't change how the system functioned. It didn't affect the next day's work. But it clarified something important. The company believed its infrastructure was stable because the systems kept running. What they didn't realize was how much of that stability depended on things they had never needed to think about. Not secrets, just knowledge that had slowly concentrated in one place. And once you recognize something like that, it changes the way you see the structure around you. Not with suspicion, just with clarity. Understanding a system is one thing, deciding what to do with that understanding is something else. For several days after that evening in the server room, I didn't change anything about my routine. The authentication server continued operating normally. Employees log in every morning. Meetings continued discussing deadlines, launches, and growth targets. From the outside, everything still worked. But once you see a structural risk clearly, you can't really ignore it anymore. The issue wasn't the server itself. Technically, the system was stable. With proper maintenance, it could probably run for several more years. The real issue was knowledge concentration. One person understood the deeper architecture. One person maintained the recovery procedures. One person verified the root authentication credential. Me. That wasn't healthy infrastructure design. If something happened, illness, vacation, resignation, the company would suddenly discover that an important layer of its operations depended on documentation they had never read and procedures they had never practiced. Good systems avoid that. Responsible engineers reduce single points of failure. So I began thinking through the options. The first option was obvious. I could push harder in meetings, insist that leadership allocate time to fully review the authentication architecture, train additional administrators, and distribute the maintenance responsibilities. Technically, that would solve the problem. But I had already seen how those conversations tended to go. Technical explanations shortened, preventative work postponed, urgent business priorities are taking precedence. Even if the conversation happened, there was a strong chance it would simply be delayed again. The second option was more practical. I could quietly prepare a complete maintenance package, documentation clear enough that another systems administrator could eventually take over the authentication server without needing my direct involvement. That would require time, careful organization, and a willingness from leadership to eventually bring someone else into the process. But it was achievable. Then there was a third option. Not an aggressive one, not even a confrontational one, just neutral. I could simply continue doing my job exactly as assigned, maintain the system, monitor the logs, handle maintenance when scheduled, and allow the company to operate exactly the way it had been operating for years. No arguments, no warnings repeated, just quiet execution. For a while, I considered each possibility carefully, not emotionally, the way engineers evaluate system changes, looking at the risks, looking at the likely outcomes. And eventually, something became clear. Responsibility only works when it is recognized. If a system depends on someone's knowledge, the organization maintaining that system should understand that dependency. Otherwise, the structure becomes fragile without realizing it. So, I made a decision, not to escalate, not to protest, just to continue my work exactly as defined by my role. Maintain the infrastructure, respond to requests, attend meetings, and let the structure of the system remain exactly as the company had chosen to build it. It wasn't a dramatic choice, just a quiet one. But sometimes the most irreversible decisions are the ones that simply allow existing patterns to continue uninterrupted. After making that decision, nothing about my behavior changed in any obvious way. I still arrived at the office early most mornings. The hallway lights were usually dim when I walked in, and the quiet hum from the server room sounded the same as it always had. Routine is comforting in technical work. Systems like consistency, so I kept my routine exactly the same. Every morning began with the same checklist. Review overnight logs, confirm backup completion, check authentication token health, scan for permission anomalies. Most days the results were reassuring. The infrastructure remained stable. Employees logged in without noticing anything unusual. Internal tools synchronized normally. From the company's perspective, everything worked exactly as it should. And because everything worked, no one asked many questions. That was the nature of infrastructure. Success is invisible, But while my routine stayed the same, I began organizing my work slightly differently, not dramatically, just carefully. The authentication documentation I had been maintaining for years was reorganized into clearer sections. System diagrams were updated. Maintenance procedures were rewritten step by step so that each phase could be followed logically without relying on memory. It was the kind of documentation most engineers wish existed when they inherit an old system. Clear, methodical, complete. I didn't announce that I was doing it. Documentation rarely requires an announcement, it simply accumulates. At the same time, I began reviewing the company's scheduled maintenance calendar more closely. There was already an operation planned several weeks ahead, a routine infrastructure update that would include resetting parts of the authentication permission hierarchy. The maintenance window had been approved during a short operations meeting. Most people in the room had treated it as a standard technical task. From the outside, it was. But maintenance like that required the deeper recovery procedure, the one that eventually reached the final step, root authentication access. I reviewed the maintenance plan again one evening. Everything was correct. Dependencies mapped, rollback procedures prepared, service restart sequences verified. Technically, the operation would be straightforward. 2 hours of preparation, 15 minutes of controlled downtime, then everything would resume as normal. I added a few final notes to the documentation folder and saved the updated files. None of this felt dramatic. In fact, it felt very ordinary. This was simply the kind of preparation responsible administrators perform before any infrastructure maintenance. Quiet planning, careful documentation, clear procedures. The kind of work that prevents problems rather than responding to them. And because nothing unusual was happening, no one in the company thought much about it. Meetings continued discussing quarterly growth targets. Product teams prepared new feature releases. Sales teams focused on expanding client accounts. Meanwhile, the systems behind all of those activities continued running smoothly, exactly as they had for years. From the outside, it probably looked like nothing had changed at all. But sometimes the most significant movements inside a system happen silently. Not through sudden actions, just through preparation, step by step, document by document, until the structure of the situation becomes clear enough that events can unfold naturally. No confrontation required, no announcement necessary, just the quiet continuation of a process that had already been set in motion. The morning everything changed began like most others, quiet, predictable. I arrived a little later than usual that day. Not dramatically late. Just enough that the morning operations meeting had already started when I walked into the conference room. 7 minutes, as I would later learn very precisely. The room was already full. Daniel stood near the front of the table, mid-conversation with the product lead about the upcoming maintenance window scheduled for that afternoon. A few laptops were open, coffee cups were scattered across the table. The usual rhythm of a short meeting is moving quickly through agenda items. When I entered, several people glanced up briefly. Daniel checked the clock on the wall, then he looked directly at me. "Olivia," he said. The room quieted slightly. "Meeting started at 9. His tone wasn't angry, just sharply, the way managers sound when they want to reinforce a rule. "Yes," I said calmly. "I'm sorry. Traffic was slower this morning." Daniel paused for a moment, arms crossed. For a second, I thought he might simply continue the meeting. Instead, he said something that surprised even a few people in the room. "If we allow people to drift in late, we lose discipline." The words were delivered like a principle rather than a criticism. Then he added, almost casually, "I think it's best we address that clearly." A few people shifted slightly in their chairs. Daniel turned toward the HR representative sitting near the end of the table. "I'm going to make a decision here," he said. "Olivia, we're going to terminate your position effective immediately." The room went very still, not shocked exactly, more uncertain. Public decisions like that create a strange silence. People aren't sure where to look or how to react. I felt something close to surprise, but not anger, mostly curiosity, because the decision had clearly been made quickly, almost impulsively. Daniel continued speaking. "We need people who respect time and structure," he said. "This company is growing fast, and discipline matters." He gestured briefly toward the door. HR will handle the formal process. That was it. 3 years of work summarized into a short managerial decision, delivered in less than 30 seconds. No argument followed. I closed my laptop slowly and stood. Understood, I said. A few colleagues looked uncomfortable. One of the engineers avoided eye contact entirely. Another seemed like he might say something, then changed his mind. Meetings have their own gravity. Once a decision is spoken, most people simply allow it to stand. I left the room quietly and walked with the HR representative to her office. The exit process was straightforward. Laptop returned, security access deactivated, a few forms signed. She seemed slightly nervous while explaining the paperwork. "I'm sure this was unexpected," she said. "It's okay," I replied. And strangely, it was, because something about the situation felt less like a confrontation and more like a structural shift. By late morning, I was outside the building. My work badge had already been disabled. Inside the company, the meeting continued. The rest of the day unfolded exactly as planned. Employees logged into their systems. Product teams prepared their afternoon updates. And later that day, the company still expected to perform the scheduled infrastructure maintenance, the one involving the authentication server, the one that required the recovery protocol, and eventually, the root credential. At first, nothing seemed different. But systems, like organizations, often take time to notice when something important has quietly been removed. For most of the afternoon, the company continued operating as if nothing had changed. Employees logged into their systems, emails moved normally between departments, internal dashboards loaded without delay. From the outside, the organization looked exactly the same as it had that morning. But inside the IT workspace, the team was preparing for the scheduled authentication server maintenance. The task had been on the calendar for weeks. It was a routine operation meant to reset the internal permission hierarchy and clear several authentication conflicts that had been slowly accumulating in the system. The procedure itself wasn't unusual. Infrastructure like that requires periodic maintenance. Around 2 o'clock, Daniel gathered the remaining engineers. "Let's begin the auth server maintenance prep," he said. The process started smoothly. Services connected to the authentication system were paused in a controlled order. Several internal tools went offline temporarily, exactly as planned. Employees had already been notified that a short interruption might occur. Everything looked normal. One of the engineers opened the maintenance documentation folder and began following the instructions step by step. Stop dependent services, verify backup integrity, reset the permission hierarchy scripts. Each phase was completed exactly as described. The documentation was clear and easy to follow. Whoever had written it had made sure every step was carefully explained. Eventually, the process reached the final section: Authentication Recovery Protocol. The engineer scrolled slowly through the instructions. The procedure explained how to rebuild the root permission structure safely, something required whenever the authentication hierarchy was reset. Near the end of the document, a single line appeared: Root authentication credential required. The engineer paused. He searched the document again, expecting to find the credential reference. Instead, the notes explained something else. The root credential was stored offline and verified periodically by the systems administrator responsible for the authentication server. He frowned slightly. "Does anyone know where the root credential is?" he asked. A few engineers looked up from their screens. One of them opened the credential verification log. The entries were simple records showing the dates the credentials had been confirmed. Each entry listed the same name: Olivia Hartwell. The engineer leaned back slightly. "Olivia handled this," he said quietly. Daniel turned toward him. "What do you mean by handled?" "She maintained the authentication recovery protocol," the engineer replied. "According to this log, she verified the root credential." Daniel's expression shifted. "Okay," he said. "Where is it stored?" The engineer checked the internal password vault. Nothing. Another engineer searched the secure credential database. Still nothing. The documentation explained the procedure clearly. But the credential itself wasn't stored in any shared system. The room grew noticeably quieter. Someone asked the obvious question. Did Olivia normally provide it during maintenance? No one answered. Daniel looked around the room. Can we bypass it? The engineer shook his head after reviewing the instructions again. No. The recovery process requires root authentication. Without it, we can't complete the reset safely. For a moment, no one spoke. The system itself wasn't broken. The maintenance plan had been correct. The documentation was accurate. But the final step required something no one in the room had access to, and the person who maintained it had left the building several hours earlier. Only then did the structure of the problem become clear. The system had been working perfectly, because the one person who understood it completely had been there to maintain it. And now she wasn't. Late that afternoon, my phone rang. I had been home for a few hours by then, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, reviewing a few personal notes from my notebook. The day still felt strangely calm, almost quiet after the sudden decision that morning. The number on the screen belonged to the company, I answered. Hello? There was a short pause before Daniel spoke. Olivia. His voice sounded different from the confident tone he usually carried in meetings. Not angry, just careful. Yes, I replied. We're in the middle of the authentication server maintenance, he said. The team can't complete the recovery procedure. I waited. The documentation says a root credential is required, he continued. Do you know where that credential is stored? I took a moment before answering. The recovery protocol explains the storage method, I said calmly. Another pause. Yes, Daniel said. It says the credential is verified and maintained by the systems administrator. That's correct. The silence on the line stretched slightly longer this time. Can you provide it? He asked. There was no accusation in his voice, just urgency. I chose my words carefully. I'm no longer employed by the company, I said. Your HR department disabled my access and collected my work laptop this morning. Another pause. Longer. Daniel spoke it again, quieter now. We need to complete the maintenance. I understand, I said. Neither of us raised our voices. There was no argument, no anger, just the quiet recognition of a situation that had already taken shape. Finally, he said, Is there any way you could help us resolve it? I looked down at the notebook resting on the table beside me. For 3 years, it had contained diagrams, procedures, and reminders that helped keep the company's systems running smoothly. I'm sure the documentation will guide the team as far as possible, I said. The sentence was calm, neutral, not confrontational, just factual. Another moment passed. Then Daniel sighed softly. I see. The call ended a few seconds later, and with it, the last conversation I would ever have with my former manager. A few weeks after that day, my life had already started to look different. Not dramatically, just quieter. I took some time to rest first. After years of constant system monitoring and early mornings in the server room, the sudden stillness felt unusual. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't responsible for anything critical running somewhere in the background. No alerts, no maintenance windows, no meetings. Eventually, I began consulting for smaller companies, organizations that actually wanted someone to review their infrastructure carefully before problems appeared. The work felt different. Conversations were slower, questions were welcomed, and most importantly, knowledge was shared instead of quietly assumed. Sometimes people ask if I regret how things ended at my old company. I don't. Nothing dramatic happened. No revenge, no confrontation. Just a moment when a system revealed how it had really been working all along. And if there is one thing years of maintaining infrastructure teach you, it's this. A stable system isn't built on assumptions. It's built on understanding. Looking back, the story isn't really about being fired. And it isn't about a password. It's about something quieter that happens in many workplaces. When systems work well, people stop asking how they work. When someone solves problems consistently, others begin to assume those solutions will always be there, until one day they aren't. I never wanted anyone to panic or fail. The systems I maintained were designed to work, and for 3 years they did. But that experience reminded me of a simple truth. Reliability should never become invisible. If someone quietly holds an important part of a system together, the healthiest organizations make sure that knowledge is respected, shared, and understood. Not because something might go wrong, But because good systems and good teams are built on awareness. So, I'm curious about something. Have you ever been in a situation where people relied on your work every day, but never really saw the role you were playing behind the scenes?
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.